sitting in. Okay. Cool. Thank you for being mobile.
Bye-bye.
Having mobile bodies, right? So the space is called, we did healing our bodies, right? So, yeah, maybe if you don't have something that part to share, maybe how we came to doing the work that we do in relation to body and healing. I don't know.
That's how I put together my formal and informal presentation.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Do you want to start first?
I'm okay with this.
Okay. So I did prepare something. It's not very formal, but I feel better when I've actually written something down. I join you here today for the Conference Against Environmental Racism, and I'm honored to be a guest to share this space with everybody. Now, even though my background is not directly related to traditional notions of fighting against environmental racism, I wanted to share with you how I seek to create better self-care and wellness for those of us non-white racialized minorities living in a white settler nation, that is the USA. Through my training in my doctoral program when I attended University of California, Davis, I learned that environmental racism could be defined as, for instance, finding a disproportionately higher number of incinerators near communities of color in comparison to white communities. People of color are deliberately exposed to toxic facilities and chemicals because they are thought of as being worthless by corporations and politicians. Most of you here today are already aware of this phenomenon, so I won't go further into it. However, I wanted to talk about another type of toxicity many of us are exposed to, the inner toxicity that builds up in so many of us people of color that's forced to remain hidden and silent in order to appear strong, fearless, and even a martyr. I speak mostly from the experience of a black female, but I do know that a lot of what I will share is experienced by tens of thousands of non-white people in the struggle against racism here in the USA. Being called a skinny little nigger the first day of 7th grade scared me beyond belief. Now, despite finishing that school year and receiving the Haiti Hewitt Award for the highest GPA in my class, the words from that first day of school did not go through one ear and out the other. It was too toxic for me to handle, but I dare not let anyone know how painful it was. After all, it couldn't be that bad because I was outwardly performing as if nothing anyone could say could stop me. I missed learn very early as a child that I cannot show or display that I have been emotionally damaged by white racism. I was taught that no matter what, I needed to work very hard, become a straight-A student, and not let what many of my misinformed school peers say get the best of me. Growing up in an all-white working-class New England town as one of several black kids, that was quite a feat. I love my parents very much, and I know their advice to me was simply out of love and the desire to see that I and my twin become part of the talented 10th. I realized that it was outward performance that seemed to be the most important method of showing to an anti-black society that the toxicity of racism would not derail my drive to succeed and achieve the standard markers of success that have been defined by the USA, i.e., graduating at the top of my high school class and being accepted into an Ivy League institution. I graduated from high school with one of the highest final grades and simultaneously with the lowest self-esteem and self-worth. I had never been comfortable with or even admitting that I needed emotional and spiritual nourishment, even while attending Dartmouth College and finding myself on the trajectory becoming a black feminist scholar. I would never allow myself to cry, not even in private. I had trained myself not to let many of my outwardly prejudiced white Dartmouth peers know that their ignorance and entitlement was devastatingly toxic and painful for my soul, or that it made it difficult to freely navigate the coveted space of dynastic whiteness that is Hanover, New Hampshire. I worked hard, devouring everything black feminist theory and queer theory that I could get my hands on. I intellectualized everything I read and outwardly showed my prowess as a writer at Dartmouth, receiving several citations for the work I had done. On the outside, I looked like a strong black woman. I performed that stereotype. I consumed that stereotype. Instead of allowing myself to grieve and cry, even privately, from the years of surviving through and experiencing racist, sexist environments, I had filled myself with what would be considered unnourishment of nutritionally vapid foodstuffs. I did not know how to take care of myself on a spiritual, physical, and emotional level as someone with what I would call racism, sexism-induced repetitive shock syndrome. Even though my activist scholarship was dedicated to the social justice of showing how Black feminism and queer theory can unmask the violence of taken-for-granted spaces of whiteness and heteronormativity, I was not giving myself the same internal justice. I was being violent to myself by denying myself the justice of physical and emotional nourishment. I was always tired. When I menstruated, I bled heavy for days and overdosed on Aleve. I was unable to sleep well. I saw a mental health professional provided by the school twice. He never really asked me deep questions to get to the root of the insomnia. Instead, he prescribed to me some sleeping pills that didn't seem to work. It seemed that he was never critically trained to question how the racist, classist, sexist, normal Dartmouth environment could somehow make the few non-white kids there feel unsafe. It never occurred to him to ask me about that or even what I was eating. What I was eating was a lot of candy, chocolate, drinking Dr. Pepper soda for breakfast, eating Hershey bars for breakfast. Things that were not doing my body any type of justice. My supposedly Black feminist mind was so colonized by the corporate capitalist food system, it never occurred to me that I was using unnourishing foods and over-the-counter drugs to deal with the insanity of living in hostile climates, such as the USA. The fast sugar highs, the opiates released from consuming fast food milkshakes, the chocolate comfort foods. Why didn't anyone tell me any differently? You are not a strong Black woman if you cannot let yourself cry. You are not a strong Black woman if you hold it inside, it makes you die. You are not a strong Black woman if you cannot let yourself cry. You're not a strong Black woman if you hold it in and it makes you die. You are a strong Black woman if you nourish yourself and learn to cry. You are a strong Black woman if you nourish yourself and learn to cry. When I was diagnosed with fibroid tumors at the tender age of 23, it was my wake-up call. Even though I know our ailments cannot solely be attributed to diet, I do know that to a large degree mine was. And of course, I could not have expected to nourish my womb, my entire body, my soul, by responding to my hurt and grief through unmindful consumption of foods that were not compatible with my unique physiology and spiritual needs. It was time to decolonize my own mind and my own body around the false notions of what makes a strong Black woman. It was time to stop distracting myself with intellectualizing everything and being that outwardly good performer, and to make my mind, body, and soul central to a new type of decolonizing Black feminism that needed to start with the realization that my own body and mind is a microsite of environmental racism, as well as the site of the unintended physical and psychic consequences of the strong Black woman syndrome. Unlike many women in my family who were diagnosed with fibroids and had hysterectomies, I decided that I did not want to go that route. A major catharsis happened in 2005 when I met Dr. Diane Johnson, who introduced me to the work of Queen Afu and Afu's seminal book, Sacred Woman, an Afrocentric approach to veganism for women of African descent. In it, I discovered a world of spiritual and food justice for the collectivity of Black women in the USA who apparently have the same experiences of holding in our pain, grief, and suffering caused by legacies of colonialism and racism. Now, even though I do not agree that the womb is central to making a Black woman a true woman, as Queen Afua does, I learned crucial steps I should take to release myself from consuming the strong Black woman syndrome and release myself from consuming the ideals of a morally corrupt food system. And through this new Afrocentric approach to nutritional and spiritual healing, I learned that decolonial justice and healing for our communities cannot be fully realized if I cannot allow myself to grieve, to cry, to holler, and release, which is why I choose to sing at these conferences, because it's a way for me to really express what's going on inside me. And it's just something for people to think about if you're used to going to traditional academic conferences, where by default you have to do the language of the colonizer, but you're not really allowed to express yourself scholarly using artistic methods. And I try to break that down because, at least with my upbringing, my ancestors, it's through music and voice and drumming, and that's how we release a lot of those emotions and really release what's going on inside of us. So I choose to share that gift with you as another form of wisdom and information that I can't actually translate as well if I just hand you a dissertation. So what's the Sistah Vegan Project? In 2006, I started the Sistah Vegan Project. It's a critical approach to consumption while advocating for a plant-based dietary philosophy. Now, central to this project are the lives of Black women and girls and how we can develop a critical literacy of consumption that fits our individual lives, while simultaneously taking into consideration of how structural racism, neoliberal whiteness, corporate capitalism, sexism, classism, ableism, sizeism, and heteronormativity influence our consciousness around food politics. Now, most importantly, what is central to this project is the understanding of the fact that self-care is environmental and food justice. The Sistah Vegan Project is constantly evolving, and the beauty of the project is that even though food justice is one aspect of it, it is not the only aspect. As the founder, I lovingly urge our builders to not be afraid to share their emotional pain and frustration. There is no weakness in admitting that you have been unable to sleep, that you have developed high blood pressure, or that you even thought you were supposed to have your kale smoothie that day, but instead you caved in and you ate a whole pint of vegan coconut ice cream. Nourishing ourselves, even as we transition into a whole foods plant-based diet, shouldn't be about falling back into the trap of some fundamentalist belief about what a vegan and conscious, strong person of color should be. It is all too easy to go from being addicted to unnourishing foods of the corporate capitalist processed foods kitchen to being addicted to some ideal notion of some fundamental righteous way of being a raw foodist. Now, a lot of women in the African holistic health community, they're doing really great work. But I also have seen that a lot of them tend to look down on other women who may have chosen to eat a piece of fried tofu and have not gone, for example, completely raw. And I advocate that we shouldn't be beating ourselves up because we think we're showing weakness because we're not eating some ideal holistic vegan diet. So if one can strive for a cultivation of unconditional love for oneself, as well as those around us, this is where food and environmental justice can be birthed. All too frequently, I have begun to see a type of self-righteousness amongst whole foods vegans of African descent that becomes self-absorbed and focusing on a type of exclusive food justice that focuses on one's individual body as the site of some unattainable purity, without regards to how even new super vegan foods are potentially causing disharmony and destruction of other indigenous communities and environments. With the Sistah Vegan Project, I have tried to shift attention away from the individualist notions of consuming to purify and decolonize the Black female body, to understanding our own roles in the food system, often as privileged North American consumers who may not realize the negative impact we have when we start advocating for the consumption of healthier commodities that have been extrapolated using exploited human labor. So even though we haven't actually found any concrete answers, The Sistah Vegan Project is a site to cultivate healing, critical consciousness, and mindfulness for the collectivity of Black females in the USA who are ready to admit that we aren't necessarily strong Black women.
Cool. I guess what I have to say is there aren't a lot of people of color in this room, which happens every year at the care conference. It's a bit frustrating. But I know there are a lot of women. I know there are a lot of queer people. And like, even if we don't all share the queer woman of color or woman of color perspective or mother of color, being a woman drags us into like self-destruction as well as just being queer. So a lot of us are affected by this like almost like self-punishing that I heard you talking about, because like that's what I experience as well. But I guess more on the political side, like as people that know colonization through patriarchy, through racism, through homophobia, like in healing ourselves, sometimes we do like enact that colonization on other communities. So what do we do? And like what are our responsibilities as people that are here suffering under the same system that creates that like violence somewhere else? But how do we like connect our healings? Because we have to heal ourselves and make sure that other communities are healed as well. And that's a really big question.
So are you asking, like, what does, like, people that are here today, what can they do, or people of color, or allies?
I mean, I can speak from being like a woman of color that lives in a vegan household, that we decided not to buy quinoa because it was being sourced from Bolivia, and it's almost like conflict quinoa. And we didn't know what to do, so we were like, we're just gonna ban this because we don't know. I guess that's a starting point, but like, it's just so difficult to like try and like become like vegan, and like sometimes if that like helps our bodies, like how do we like keep it from hurting the world, I guess.
Yeah, that's a pretty, I mean, that's the kind of question that you really need to break down into, I mean, even that is problematic. And I've encountered that with other professors myself, in this banning of quinoa. And I can talk a little bit on that, but I think I would also like to situate myself in this space. Not everybody knows who I am, so I just want to also give some of that. Also, too, for those that don't know, this is usually like a meaning of like, yeah, like an affirmation, like yes. It's also something like that I've been taught within my indigenous communities. It's like a hope, you know, and for us that's a sign, perhaps. You can always do this, power fist, and that's also an affirmation. Like, yes, I hear you, and I like to hear more. So we'll just make some more space. There's no chairs. Yeah, welcome. Come on in. No, we see Flavia. So my name is Claudia Serrato, and I'm originally from LA. I was born and raised in East LA. Both my parents migrated at a very young age to the United States. Note, I don't say America because America is a continent, right? We're talking about Abya Yala and Turtle Island. And so I just want to make sure we know I'm talking about the U.S., right? And so when my parents migrated over, they were in their teens, and they had entered this country on a very plant-based diet. And not that they were consciously aware of it, but when I talked back to them, I asked them, well, what kind of foods were you eating, My mom would say, well, I was eating beans, rice, nopales, which is cactus, tortilla, salsa, which is chili, right? And not like chili beans, like chili like salsa. I had an experience one where I told somebody, oh, I'm gonna make some chile, and they're like, oh yeah, and then I make salsa. They're like, I thought you were making chili. I'm like, this is chili. I just trying to make that very clear. And I'm like, Mom, if you really think about it, like that's a vegan diet. Like your food's pretty vegan, if you ask me, you know, plant-based. And she's like, oh, mija, well, I never thought about it that way. To me, it's just, you know, Mexican food, you know. But it was something, but it's not something that she was prideful of. Because in the United States, you're sort of, you know, through many imperialist, colonialist devices, right? Like media, for example. And the way you're marketed is like, you know, you need to have your meat on the table, right? And so for my family, it was almost something that you ate very discreetly. It's not something that you participated in public. And so, you know, as a result of Americanization and how that takes place on the migrant body, who is grown and raised with strong indigenous values, my parents' food ways changed. And not just my parents, but my grandfather, because my grandfather had migrated here before my parents did. And my grandfather from my mother's side, niña, otra niña, sí, de jugar. And what happened is both my parents gained some weight, and growing up, I was nicknamed gorda, which is fat girl. But in Spanish, it's almost a way of like showing love, like, oh, you know, gordita, ven aquí, you know, hey, gordita, come here, and it's just your nickname. But something I don't think my parents were realizing is that I also fell into that, and I was like, okay, gorda means fat, like, okay. And then, you know, going to an Orthodox, Catholic Orthodox, run by white nuns, Irish nuns, that really was, you know, understanding, okay, well, my nickname is Gorda at home, I'm here at school, and my mom make me a bean burrito. I am not going to eat a bean burrito at a Catholic school. I'm going to take on cafeteria food, you know, and so cafeteria food was, you know, chocolate milk, you know, some slimpy sausage and whatever else they gave us. Very processed, very, very processed. And what happened is I actually became gorda. Like, it just wasn't a nickname. It was something that happened to me. And so I filled in pretty well, but not extreme, but pretty well. And so, like, conditions began to change in my family. Like, my grandfather got really sick. He had a heart attack. Some aunts became diabetic. My father had high cholesterol. But it was almost talked about, like, oh, like, it's just a natural thing. It just happens. Like, okay, you know, it's just, you know, that's just what you do. You take pills, you know, la medicina, right? Para el colesterol, like, it's just a common talk. You take medicine for cholesterol, like, and, you know, I was finally, when I was in my early 20s, I'm in my mid-30s now, I had moved to Northern California. So I wanted to, you know, explore the world, get out of my comfort zone, and I was out in Humboldt County, and there, I really it was a culture shock. People were living off the land, people were eating all this really great healthy food, and I learned a lot about indigenous ways of eating from just, you know, the communities out there, and being introduced to just a different diet, a different, less processed diet, and you know, so I was just really impressed by this, and it was a cool thing to be vegetarian at that time, so I was like, oh, I'm going to be vegetarian because everybody else is, and if I'm not vegetarian, then I'm not cool. And I was out there for 2 years. When I came back home to LA, because home is LA, all my family was making fun of me because they were having a carne asada, which is like grilled beef, right? And they're like, oh, you know, we're all getting together, and I wasn't eating that. I was like, oh no, you know, I'm vegetarian now. And they're like, oh, look at Claudia, she thinks she's white, and it was just this thing, right? Like, that's how my parents and my family saw this change of way of eating. But I just didn't quite understand it. I wasn't politically aware. I still it was just sort of like this thing that I was doing. And then my grandfather had another heart attack. And at that point, I was like, okay, this is real. Like, something is happening here. And I remember I had gone in for an examination myself, this physical. And the doctor had asked me, okay, so, your family backgrounds, anybody have cancer? Well, yeah, my grandmother died of cancer. Okay. Anybody else? Oh, my mom had breast cancer. Oh, okay. Anybody who's diabetic, cholesterol, that list that they ask you, right, when you go to traditional, or I guess what I would say, non-traditional medicine, which is dominant medicine, right? See? And then I was told, okay, well, most likely then you're going to get this. And I was like, why most likely? Like, what is it about me? And they're like, oh, well, it's in your family line. And I thought, well, it's a genetic thing. It's what I thought. I was like, oh, it's just a genetic thing, and I'm damned, right? Like, I'm gonna get old, and I'm gonna become diabetic. I'm gonna have high cholesterol, and I'm gonna have a heart attack. And that just really didn't sit well with me at all. I was very, very bothered by that. And so what I did is I wanted to understand, well, why was my grandfather having heart attacks? What was up, right? And so I began asking him questions about what he ate when he was a youth, when he ate when he was a teen, and then when he just, came to the United States. And I began to take note that he was eating processed cheese. He started to drink milk. He started to eat a heavily based, animal-based diet. And that's when all these diseases started to kick in, right? So processed butter and flour tortillas. This is no food that he was eating out in the rancho, right? This is that's just not how it was. And then so I wanted to, at that time I was learning about decolonization. What does it mean to decolonize? Because back in LA, people would always say to me, oh, you got to decolonize your mind, because it was all about decolonizing the mind. And I was like, okay, and I thought to myself, well, what does it mean to decolonize the body? Why does that feel different to me, right? Why does decolonizing the body feel different to me than decolonizing the mind? There's a relationship, but what is that relationship? And in order for me to really understand that, I had to understand food and my relationship to food and my grandfather's relationship to food and my parents' relationship to food. And, so I was pretty naive. I had no idea that a lot of the food that is dominant in Mexican food is not dominant in Mexican food, particularly here in the United States. And I want to say maybe in urban locations out in Mexico, right? And Baja California. And it's food that came during the time of conquest. Okay, so example, the cow, right? The cow is not indigenous to the Americas. The chicken is not indigenous to the Americas, right? Lard, which is assumed that, that's part of, you need to have lard to make tamales, right? That's not indigenous to the Americas. So when I began to understand that, it was just an instant way of just understanding, okay, wait a minute. So if I wanted to colonize my body, and my mind, I need to decolonize my diet. And by decolonizing my diet is I need to start pulling out what it is that's getting my family and me sick, right? Because it's not just about my genetic makeup, please. No, it's something that I'm eating. And it's a way of eating that is not, it's not the healthiest, right? And it's not just the healthiest for my body, because at the same time, I'm also instilled with indigenous values and principles. And those indigenous values and principles are considerate of the land, are considerate of the waters, are considerate of other species, right? Which we tend to separate and call animals, right? When we are ourselves animals, right? So I'm putting it out there. I'm an anti-speciesist. And ahorita we think, so I began to realize, well, ¿qué quieres? ¿Qué es lo que quieres? Oh, quiero otra silla, aquí. Aquí. So in understanding, okay, Ben, I think so. We'll get another chair. There we go. So anyways, I began to blog about this. Okay, I began to blog a lot of what I'm sharing with everybody here in 2008. So with Dean's father and I began to blog. We created a blog called Decolonial Food For Thought. And out of that blog, we just kept posting our ideas and our thoughts and our reflection. We started doing a lot of workshops in the community. And I wrote a piece that was really controversial, and it's called Indigenous Veganism. And that was just, I was attacked for writing a piece like that. It's like, well, how can indigenous food be vegan, you know? And I began to explain, well, if you really look at what an indigenous-based diet is, right, the majority of our foodway it's not animal-based, right? It's really heavily plant-based. And by plant-based, I want to say at least 80% plant-based, right? So the other 20% was supplemented with some of the animal foods that some people eat today. And so there's a whole, critical component to that, and I'm more than happy to share and talk more about that, but I just want to just move us forward. And so I've taken my work that is rooted from Indigenous veganism, and I've been able to navigate the educational pipeline, and it's very difficult for women of color, single mother women of color, with parents who, are middle class, cannot, pay for my college education, right, just from their spare change. And so it's been a mission to get here. Right now, I'm presently working on my exams. I'm for my qualifying exams for my doctorate degree, and I'm going to be taking those real soon. And but my work has now shifted to where I'm saying, okay, yeah, we're decolonizing our mind, we're decolonizing our body. But if we're going to decolonize our body, then we also need to decolonize our taste buds, right? And in order for us to decolonize our taste buds, it needs to begin somewhere. And that somewhere for me was my womb, right? So I am a carrier of a womb. I am privileged to have a womb, in my sense of that word. And so my work now is on indigenous womb ecology. And so that is focused on, and I don't want to say decolonizing the next generation's taste buds, because it doesn't need to be decolonized. It's just maintaining and tapping into the memory of an indigenous way of eating, right? So, my daughter is one example of that, where I have learned that when a child is in the womb, through the amniotic fluid, the child begins to taste, right? So we're talking about taste development, and so taste memory. So, my work now is looking at taste memory, so decolonizing taste, and I'm focusing on children and toddlers, because also too, a lot of food justice and environmental justice is very adult-centric, and I just can't take it anymore, And so for me, the focus now is the next generation, the youth. And so, so that's who I am. That's where I'm at with my work, and I'd be more than happy to talk about indigenous veganism. But I will, warning, it'll make some of us feel very uncomfortable, because I'm sure a few of us here are vegan in the U.S. way of defining that word, and so yeah. But that's what I'll have to say for now. We can open it up or continue on.
Does anybody have questions? Comments?
I'm sorry that I came in late. I was helping someone head back to I-5. You just mentioned something about the U.S. Kind of veganism. I was wondering if you could explain a little more about that.
Okay, so we're going to go there. Okay, so I can tell you what indigenous veganism is, which is different than perhaps the veganism that is the norm, okay? So, indigenous veganism, the very first thing that it moves, or is the foundation of indigenous veganism, is our relationship, the relationship that we have with our animal relatives, right? So, we ourselves are animals, so another species, right? Another organisms. With indigenous veganism, it is a way of eating that is grounded in plant-based eating, but it's also eats with the seasons, right? So you eat with the seasons. You also eat compassionately. Compassionately, for example, looking at U.S. vegans, right, is you're a compassionate eater. You don't, the word is horrible, it's a very bad word, K-I-L-L, right? You don't do that to animals. And it's because of how that is happening, right? We have slaughterhouses, which is just unbelievable. Like, that idea just throws me off. We have massive fisheries, right? We have these fish farms. So within indigenous ways of knowing, right, or indigenous epistemology, and those that are very conscious eaters, like, we will not eat fish that is farmed. The idea of buying fish at a market is insulting to some people that I've worked with. It's like the most insulting thing. Beef, pig, and chicken is not eaten for some, because that's processed, that is domesticated, and there's a lot of abuse. There's no relationship. There is some of our elders who go out and they'll do a ceremony. So they'll have a deer ceremony, and they'll go out and they'll hunt, and they'll bring back an elder deer. But in that process, there was a lot of compassion that took place, right? There's prayer, there's reciprocity, there is relationship, there's this whole act that takes place in that ceremony of hunting, for example, right? And you bring back the deer, and there's prayer, there's other things that take place, right? But that meat that is shared or eaten at that time is not something that's eaten every day. It's not something that is like, okay, let's just grill it up in a burger. You know, because that's just inconceivable, right? Like, you just don't do that. So indigenous veganism, it's sort of a play on Western veganism or U.S. veganism, where it's saying, well, yeah, you are eating these vegan foods, but if you really look at your food, it's pretty indigenous. You're eating your beans, you're eating your wild rice if you're buying it from Winona LaDuke, right? Out in the Monument, supporting her rice. You're eating corn tortillas, you're eating, spinach enchiladas, you're eating all these foods, and if you really look at you're either eating quinoa or you're not, right? That's pretty indigenous to the Americas, right? So but there's also but we're not eating burgers, we're not drinking milk. There's, cheese and all these other foods that, are dominant foods, right? Counter to U.S. vegans or Western vegans, the idea of compassion is you just don't K-I-L-L, at all. But those values are very different from indigenous values. Those are based on imperialist ideas, and so it's a process of reclaiming and saying, hold on, we need to carve something out here. We need to tap into this other way of knowing, because we cannot let these dominant ideals play out on our way of eating. Because as it already is, our food ways have been appropriated, right? And it's called vegan, when it's like, hold on, that platter is indigenous. So that's just a little bit on that. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you.
I'm just a little distracted with my daughter, sorry, so I'm trying to do both, and I have Amy here who's helping me out
It's almost
with my thing.
seamless. No, it's good.
Sí, ve jugar con ella. So.
I have a question. I don't know if either of you have seen the reality show James Oliver, where he goes to schools and tries to change how they eat. And I saw an episode recently where he goes to LA and he works in a school that's predominantly, I would say, people of color, and he goes to people's homes and says, oh, well, this is all bad for you and this is what you should be eating. And I was wondering if maybe y'all can touch on that and maybe, because I was trying to explain to my mom why this was very upsetting to me and I couldn't quite do it. And I was wondering if maybe one of you could break that down and kind of explain, I guess, why that's a new form of colonization, perhaps, and then maybe a different way of going about it, where white allies and people and vegans of color could bring this message to a wider audience, I guess.
I don't have a TV. But what I can say is that we don't need white heroes. Yeah. So he clearly is an example of a white hero, culinary imperialist. And that's, I mean, I've heard of him just from people that live in LA and have said, oh, did you know that this person came? And I was just like, it's just another white imperialist trying to bank on some opportunity and to be the hero because, oh, people of color need help. No, we need to change the system who's providing the food into these into LA schools, right? Because these people that are in these schools, so you want to talk about low-income communities, I can guarantee you that what they're eating at home is pretty vegan. You know, so they're eating very healthy at home. What they're eating at school is pretty bad, but it's because, you know, who's providing that to them, right? Who's colonizing their bodies. Right? It's constant. It hasn't ended. Colonization is not a thing of the past. It's very present, especially in our school, in LA schools. Because I can speak of that. I'm from there.
So I was born and raised in Eugene. My parents were from Hawaii. I grew up eating beans, tortillas, chile, all stuff that's for the most part vegan, maybe a meat dish. And then I started school, and then I started eating out more because my mom thought that all food was just good for me. And so I also became known as gordo. Actually, I am still called gordo to this day, which is, as you know, a term of endearment. The thing, though, that gets me is that I still eat chicken every day. I eat frijoles and tortillas, and I eat all these things. The thing that I'm encountering with is that how do you reverse that process? Because for the most part, like, my mom didn't have this conception that any food was bad for you, because she grew up with the notion that all foods that you eat are good for you, because it's food. Food, when you eat food, it's replenishing all the things that you're missing, water, it's supposed to be good for you. So I guess for my question is, like, how do you reverse that? How do you get your piece, like hot Cheetos, right? Like, if you're Chicano, like, you love hot Cheetos. That stuff's awful. It's made, it's bad for you. And I'm just like thinking to myself, like, how do we reverse that? How do we begin to start telling people, like, oh, like frijoles and tortillas and rich that's a great meal. But for a lot of people, it's basic. They think of it as not of value.
Yeah. You want to talk a little bit about that, or?
I don't know if I hate to actually try to give a general answer to everyone, because I know everybody's situation is unique. So are you asking how you reverse that in terms of how you get the support you need from your family when you
I think it's cool. My dad will eat out. He'll eat out maybe twice a year. He eats the same thing every week, same dishes. He won't change his diet. And so he just looks the same. The thing that gets me, though, is that we have an institution, and like when we go to school, that like shames you for eating certain things you eat. So like I go to work and I have like cactus. People are like, oh, what are you eating? And they're like, oh wow, what is that? And I'm like, it's cactus. I'm like, ew, that's gross. Cactus? Why would you eat cactus? And I'm just like, are you serious? And I know that now, but I'm telling you, if I was like 14, 13, bringing that to school, like, and that's what happens to a lot of peers. Obviously, my cousins, it happens to a lot of like Chicanos, like, and people of color, like, like, they begin to change their ways of eating because what they're eating itself in a public setting is not supposed to be. They're supposed to be eating, you're supposed to like cheeseburgers, you're supposed to like french fries, you're supposed to like these things,
Yeah. Or even like we're supposed to like alcohol.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because if you don't, then like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what's important, what has been important for me is learning about the colonial history of food, right? That's something I've had to do, and that's something that I do teach. And it's so understanding, like, why do we even eat these foods? Like, how is it that they have come to be part of our diet? So beginning to like question it that way, right? And I think though too, even like getting away from this idea like, oh, you know, if you're Chicano, you like Cheetos, right? So it's like no longer contributing to that stereotype, right? It's to not say that, right? It's to be like, well, the truth is that there's a chemical in those Cheetos that have made your body addicted to them, right? So there's an addiction. So seeing the reality of it, it's not just because, it's not that you like the Cheetos.
You grew up eating it.
You're addicted to it. Yeah, there's an addiction, and it's something that's happening in the tongue, right? So taste, decolonizing your taste buds, right? But it's one thing to be like, okay, yeah, I know I have to do this, but it's like, what work is it gonna take, right? And sometimes some of that does involve having to learn the culinary history, because that's something that changed my life like overnight. Like once I understood how that process took place, and something I didn't want to do that I had to do is I had to learn how European elites ate, to understand why it is that these Spanish who, you know, these conquistadores who were really not people that were wanted in Europe, like why is it that they came with these elite ideals of eating, right? Because common people in Europe ate a plant-based diet. I mean, you know, and there was this misconception that people that ate a lot of vegetables were eating, they called it garden sauce. Like, it was just, there was no protein value. There was no, here we go. There was no vitamins, and it was just water. So people that ate a plant-based diet, they were just considered, you know, just poor and feminine-like, right? So there was this idea that people that ate plant-based food were feminine bodies, which is why that idea came when colonization occurred, is you had the indigenous people eating a plant-based diet, and it was like, okay, well, they're eating these feminine foods, so therefore these are feminine bodies, whether they, you know, had a penis or a vagina, right? They're feminine bodies. And the Spanish themselves took on these elite values of Europe, which is like, if you ate meat, that's what made you, you know, chingon, right? That's what made you a man. But yet, for the common people, you know, we have that phrase, right? Oh, bring home the bread, right? Because literally, it was about bringing home the bread. It wasn't about bringing home the meat. Because that wasn't something you ate every day. It was something that maybe in a season, when it was available, and this is something that it's a commonality between early common Europeans and indigenous peoples. So knowing that and knowing how that occurred and why that change took place, because yeah, it was considered to be a superior way of eating, right? So you have this superior way of eating coming into the Americas, or to Abya Yala, and that's what happens.
Anybody else have anything to say, or maybe I actually want to know if anyone feels comfortable just sharing. As part of the process is not just listening to us talk, but not forcing anyone to do something they're not comfortable with, but just kind of sharing, basically from what I had talked about, if you've experienced similar to the strong black woman syndrome, which I don't know if everyone knows what that is, but there is this, because it's built upon these this false notions of black women being enslavable, rapeable, because they're actually not really human. They don't really have emotions. They're very strong. They can take like the hardest working conditions. So there's kind of that from the strong black woman is kind of from that white racist colonial conception of black female bodies. But then there's also black people kind of, you know, to survive, we can't let all this stuff hurt us, so we have to pretend it doesn't hurt us, and we have to kind of persevere through the worst. It doesn't matter, and we're not going to complain that our feelings are hurt or that we're depressed, because black women don't get depressed, and we're not going to talk about that. So I'm just wondering if people have experienced something similar to that, and in terms of relationships with food, are you aware of how that may affect your relationship with food, or how you may or may not nourish yourself? And I guess kind of I'll open that question up and just leave it for anyone who wants to share.
I'd like to share something. I grew up in Los Angeles too, in Compton, California. And I was born in New York. My parents are Puerto Rican. And when I was in the California schools, my mother was given a call because my brother was mixing English and Spanish in elementary school. And so we were warned that that wasn't acceptable. So we needed to only speak English outside. I've since gotten past that, and my children all speak Spanish, and as well as English. But I'm also a member of the state in educational reform. I'm chair of the State Board of Education. I fly to various places throughout the U.S. to look at high performance in educational areas. I was in New York about 8 months ago, and I visited Washington Heights. And if you're not familiar with that, that's in that Harlem area. And these kids were knocking the socks off of all of the academic achievement standards that were required. 97% Latino. They were Dominican, 2% African American, 1% others. And everybody, there were probably 16 states that were visiting these folks. And we were trying to figure out, how do they do it? Will they do it through a lot of kind of face-to-face stuff and that intergenerational stuff that you talked about? Dance and song and communication. They had ways of communicating within their community that made them really very, very critical thinkers. And because of that, the academic stuff was easy for them. 95% of those students graduate from high school. 92% apply to colleges. So we're given a tour from the classroom, and as we're going through, there was a young lady that was touring the group that I was with, and I said, "What is it that you don't like about this school?" And she said, "The food is horrible." And I said, "Now wait a minute, you're 97% Dominican. Why don't you have Dominican food in the cafeteria?"
Yeah.
We need to have stronger relationships with schools to articulate different kinds of well-being. And food well-being and security is a huge issue. And also when you look at diabetic events with young adults and obesity, it's a huge issue. So we need to get beyond industrialized processes. And the other thing I would say is I have a certified organic blueberry field that's 23 years old, and we sell to the local markets. And also when I went back to Puerto Rico to eat some of my mother's food, they told me I couldn't get it downtown. I said, "What do you mean?" "This is the stuff that I grew up with. My mother prepared this daily. What do you mean you don't have it?" And they said, "You have to go to the country." I said, "Okay, just point me in the right direction. Where is the country?" And they told me I had to go in the rural areas where those people had not been industrialized. They were still dealing with sustainability and well-being that was face-to-face and a direct relationship with the whole natural system, their world. And I think that that's a really critical issue, and some people call that ecological intelligence. And I think that we need to look at how we create ecological intelligence, which is the cultural system, the ecological systems in nature, but the social, cultural, ecological systems that create well-being. And so the food cannot really be separated from the culture and the natural systems that are a part of that broader environment. And we need to think more broadly. And also, I would say that you need to be advocates in your local school districts for the well-being of your children, and be ready to speak up in front of the school boards and everybody else. Just demand more well-being in what occurs in the cafeteria for your children. So,
Yeah, thank you. But I also think that there's also injustice in that, because we can look into some of our schools, and some of our schools have a lot more money and a lot more privilege. So like, for example, if you go to schools, I'll say like in Beverly Hills, right? They have vegan options of their cultural food groups. Where you go to schools in East LA or Boyle Heights, you'll get Mexican food, but Mexican food is these processed hard shell tacos and this, you know, soy meat grounded with some horrible spices, you know. It's an imitation of Taco Bell meat and some diced up tomatoes and call it Mexican, right? So even that is kind of hard because they'll be like, well, you have Mexican food. The dominant people there is Mexican. Well, there you go. But it's also talking about, yeah, well, we want this to be ecological and sustainable, right? So it's going to take a lot of work. And I think if anything for us that want to be allies to people of color that are doing this work is to help them with what they need, right? And be like, oh, you know, we need to organize, we need to do, you know, get people together, then be that person to help get those people together. Or, you know, if they want to, whatever it is, whatever organizing steps are necessary and needed, right? But that's something to be critical of as well. And thinking about, well, our food should reflect the student, the you know, or the population, but there's also inequality in that process as well, because you know, some of us have more access and more money.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. The real deal has to be understood from a research-based understanding of culture and a deep understanding, not that superficial kind of business-oriented.
Yeah.
You know, that is just really after promotion and enterprise, but you're talking about a social